Hi, welcome to a presentation about our Christian heritage. Our Christian heritage is not often as it's displayed nowadays in the media, where many people in the media, many of the Democrats have an actual hatred for their Christian heritage. But our Christian heritage is really about virtue, and I'd like to show that, and I'd like to explain exactly how you can see the difference within society and what God wanted. Virtue is described as moral excellence, goodness, righteousness, conformity of one's life and conduct to moral and ethical principles, uprightness, rectitude. Well, the problem when you have in society two different groups that propose two different concepts of virtue, and that's what you have where Hillary Clinton actually used the word irredeemable to describe half of the U.S. because they didn't agree with her concept of virtue. Irredeemable. And actually, she created or wanted to foment hatred towards that half of the country. And that's actually what happened with Germany in 1933. Not all Germans had the same idea what was virtue, what wasn't virtue. Well, it got to be that a good number of Germans, not just Hitler himself, but a good number of Germans got to the point of saying that the Jews, it was virtuous to be hateful towards the Jews. And that's what we have in society today. But that's not real virtue, and that's not what our Christian heritage really is. In the American's heritage, to go through a couple of things here, I went through a passage a number of months back describing some of the fascinating history that but made U.S. revolution somewhat special. One part of that fascinating history was that the American army was pursued by the British, by a much larger force of the British, and they came up to a river, and the American army crossed the river, and then a huge rainfall came down, so that torrents of water came down the river, and the British army couldn't chase them rapidly. So they had to wait till the water subsided, and then they started going after them again. And then they just about caught up to them again when they got to another large river, and the American army got over that when a great big rainfall came and caused a huge torrent to come down the river and gave the colony's army a chance to escape and regroup, and weren't wiped out, which was a pretty fascinating thing. You know, a couple of maybe lucky breaks, some people would determine. Well, here's what Washington actually thought. Now, many of us who are older can remember the pictures of Washington, where he'd be standing on the bow of a little dory, and he's going across in the fog, and it's a famous picture of Washington. Well, what's the story around it? Well, here's the rest of the story. King George III's British Army was forced to evacuate Boston. They headed to New York. General George Washington responded by moving American troops to New York and fortifying Brooklyn Heights. Enthusiasm was high as Washington's ranks swelled to nearly 20,000. Well, they thought they were going to be in great shape. But before long, hundreds of British ships filled New York's harbor, carrying 32,000 troops to New York. It was one of the largest invasion forces in history to that date, and the thousands of wooden masts of the British ships were described as looking like a forest of trees in the harbor. Washington wrote to his younger brother, John Augustine, on May 31st, 1776, and he said, "We expect a very bloody summer of it at New York. We are not either in men or arms prepared for it. If our cause is just, as I do most religiously believe it to be, the same providence which has in many instances appeared for us will still go on to afford its aid." What's he saying? He goes, well, if our cause is just, then I believe God will be for us. Simple terms. Well, in Congress in May 1776, General William Livingston made a resolution which passed without dissent. Everybody in the U.S. Congress agreed with this resolution. Well, what was it? It said, "We earnestly recommend that Friday the 17th of May be observed by the colonies as a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer, that we may with united hearts confess and bewail our manifold sins and transgressions, and by a sincere repentance appease God's righteous displeasure, and through the merits and mediation of Jesus Christ, obtain his pardon and forgiveness." Now, some people say that the forefathers that created the United States were not Christian. Well, this was passed unanimously. Don't listen to the trash that passes as sometimes educated lately. In New York, General Washington ordered his troops on May 15th, 1776, to observe a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer. And he did it so that by their unfeigned and pious observance of their religious duties, they may incline the Lord and give her a victory to prosper her arms. In order to win at this battle that's going to take place in the summer with the British, everybody needs to fast and pray and mediate for Jesus Christ. On July 9th, 1776, messengers from Philadelphia arrived in New York and delivered to General Washington a copy of the Declaration of Independence. And Washington had read it out loud to his troops. Now, some people don't realize that a number of the American forefathers actually wanted to outlaw slavery right then and there, but because of all the various opinions on the matter at that exact moment, they didn't want to break it apart. But they did include words that they thought were behind the idea of not having slaves. And that was the words here: laws of nature and of nature's God. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Everybody remembers that expression. And it also has, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. Meaning if we do right, then God will protect us. And that's the way every Christian should look at life. Well, the citizens of New York at that time pulled down the statue of the tyrant King George, and King's College suspended all classes and later changed its name to Columbia College. Anxious preparations were made for the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, which we refer to as Long Island. It was the first major battle after America had officially declared its independence, and it was the largest battle of the entire Revolutionary War. Washington expected the British to attack from the sea, similar to what they did at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Instead, 10,000 British troops landed a distance from New York, and a British loyalist led them through Jamaica Pass. Marching all night long, they made a surprise attack on the Continental Army from behind on August 27th. An estimated 3,000 Americans were killed or wounded compared to only 392 British casualties. So what did they start with? They started with 32,000 against 20, and now we're like 32,000 against 17,000. Almost 2 to 1. As General Washington watched, 400 soldiers of the 1st Maryland Regiment charged 6 times directly into the British lines, allowing the rest of the Continental Army to find cover from being attacked from behind. He exclaimed, "Good God, what brave fellows I have lost this day," for they kept attacking to give their fellow countrymen a chance to flee. British General Howe trapped the American troops on Brooklyn Heights with their backs against the sea. That night, Washington made the desperate decision to evacuate his entire army by ferrying it across the East River to Manhattan Island. The sea was boisterous where the British ships were, but providentially calm in the East River, allowing Washington's boats to transport troops, horses, and cannons. Meaning it was really boisterous by the British, so they're expecting it the same elsewhere, and yet it was calm that they could transport cannons across the East River. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, half of the American troops were still in danger. But a miraculously thick fog lingered, blocking the evacuation from being seen by the British. Major Ben Talmadge, Washington's chief of intelligence, wrote, "As the dawn of the next day approached, those of us who remained in the trenches became very anxious for our own safety. And when the dawn appeared, there were several regiments still on duty. At this time, a very dense fog began to rise off the river, and it seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. I recollect this peculiar providential occurrence perfectly well, and so very dense was the atmosphere that I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards. We tarried until the sun had risen, but the fog remained as dense as ever. General Washington was on the last boat that left Brooklyn Heights. Had the Americans not been able to evacuate, they would have been captured and Washington would have been hung. America would have just continued as another colony in the Britain's expanding global empire." As it happened, though, after the evacuation from Brooklyn Heights, the British never again had an opportunity to capture the entire American army at one time. Washington wrote later that year, "Undergoing the strangest vicissitudes that perhaps ever attended any one contest since the creation, The hand of providence has been so conspicuous in all this, the course of the war, that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith. So Washington believed, by what actually transpired, that it was evidence, it should have been evidence to all of the Americans, that God was on their side. Well, I don't think it was the most unique thing. I think a more unique thing was when Israel left Egypt, as an example of that. But I can truly understand some of the different thought processes that went into that comment. Well, I'd like to read a passage from another American president. FDR concluded his Brooklyn, New York address, that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He said, "Whoever seeks to set one nationality against another seeks to degrade all nationalities. Whoever seeks to set one race against another seeks to enslave all races. So-called racial and religious voting blocks are the creation of designing politicians who profess to be able to deliver them on election day." What's that really saying? It's saying when people try to set race against one another, it's because some politician wants to set one group of people and say that I can get them all to vote for me. But he said this, "Every American citizen will scorn such unpatriotic politicians. The vote of Americans will be American and only American." That's what was expected. That was kind of the heritage. Americans were joined by the right to freedom and justice for all people. So what is wrong with the world today? What is wrong with the world? If the Americans had such a great start, what is wrong? Because they seem to be tearing each other apart. Well, the two greatest problems the world has faced for hundreds of years are progressive socialism, which the media will never point out, and Islam. They are both similarly and eerily similar in key philosophies. Socialists and Islam, they both are totalitarian in nature. For Islam, no one must be allowed to speak against Muhammad or the Quran, which would be opposed to Christianity altogether, but that's what Hillary tried to impose upon America. No one must be allowed to speak against socialism or the socialist elite government leaders or its tenets. What are its tenets? Sexual immorality, abortion, evolution, climate change, no God but government. What do they say? People should not be allowed to ever speak out against anything like this, and if they are allowed to speak out against stuff like that, then they should be considered haters if they speak out against abortion. So we have in Canada the most strangest and craziest abortion laws in the world. The baby can be partly born and killed, and that's not illegal in Canada. But you can't even talk about it. You can't talk about it because, according to Justin Trudeau, anybody who talks about it really is a hater of women. How ridiculous, what tripe. Anyone who disagrees with them must be killed. What happened with progressive socialists? Over 100 million of their own citizens were murdered by progressive socialists. Who are some of these progressive socialists? Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Pol Pot, KKK. They weren't Christian. There might have been the odd Christian that was deceived into thinking it was okay to be part of it, just as there's the odd Christian that are deceived to be part of BLM or Antifa, but they're not Christian. These organizations are progressive socialists, and that's right. Hitler and Lenin, they try to pretend like they're two different extremes. They're not. They're all part of the same progressive socialist viewpoints. And they murdered 100 million of their own citizens. By comparison, just millions have been killed by fanatical Islamists over that time period. And some of the progressive socialists like to say religions are the source of everything that's terrible in this world, while they execute 100 million of their own people, not counting the 100 million that they've aborted and murdering their own children. They both, progressive socialists, seek to have a civilian army to enforce. Hitler was called the Brown Shirts. They overcame the law and the police. The police became scared of the people that supported the Nazis, the Brown Shirts. Lenin and Stalin had the Secret Service, so that the police were scared because the Secret Service might be the one that's actually doing something. In the USA, the KKK and all the social justice warriors, the global warming fanatics, the Antifa and BLM, are doing the civilian army thing to enforce progressive socialism. And to some degree, the cops are getting a little bit scared about arguing with some of these different groups because the judges are progressive socialists. There's many of the progressive socialist judges that don't care what the law is. They just care what their viewpoint is. They all sought to take control from the police and enforce law so that they became a law unto themselves. And both of these groups believe they must never give up what they have won, and they do this by eliminating any historical connections. Now someone says, what's the civilian army? Well, the terrorists are the civilian army for the Islam. They try to encourage terrorism amongst all their members. They must never give, and when somebody tells you that's not the case, well, that's wrong. Islam's about submission. Muhammad himself was always about submission. And Muhammad believed in intimidating people by beheading people so that everybody else would fear and join in. And Muhammad was very successful at this. He changed about 300 Arab religions to one. I'd say that's pretty successful with it. But it's still evil. They must never give up what they have won, and they do this by eliminating any historical connections to the past. Memorials, churches, other gods. Separation of God from all society, like what you see in media, business, especially schools. And we've done this through things such as multiculturalism and human rights. Pretending these things were great ways to protect people, we actually destroyed people. They both hate Christians and Jews. Islam lies and calls them the little Satan and great Satan. Progressives lie and call them hateful, ignorant people. The irredeemable, as Hillary Clinton said in her election campaign. They both are blinded by their hatred against biblical fundamentalists. They encourage a sense of entitlement and violent revenge in their followers. Nazis had Germans thinking it was okay to take Jewish homes and businesses. Progressive socialists think it is right to steal jobs and businesses from biblical fundamentalist Jews and Christians today. They feel righteous in this, and they refer to it as white privilege. They're all about enforced submission, none of which is reflective of our historical North American Christian culture. What's the end result of progressive socialism? A sense of entitlement, divisive societies that destroy dissenters, vengeance becomes encouraged, increased hate and violence, and to give an example of how these things can deceitfully come in, you get a concept such as this, and that is, because our prison population does not match what the population groups are in general, that means the cops are either sexist or racist. Well, nobody wants to call the cops sexist in that example because there's more men in prison than women, and it can never be that the women are disadvantaged by these complaints. But are the cops racist? Because there's a higher percentage. And when you start doing these type of things, you're actually creating a false witness. There's one thing we know about people that are in prison. They've been found guilty of crimes. Maybe the odd one is innocent. It was fixed. And those people who fixed it should be condemned because they've been guilty of a crime. That's what the law is there to deal with. However, the reasons why there's differences sometimes in different populations in prison from what you have in society is because the different community groups in society sometimes have behaved differently. One of the greatest things that cause, and it doesn't occur all the time, but great higher percentage, we're talking hundreds of percent higher, is poor people in prison. Well, a great hundreds of percent higher for what will cause people to become poor or in prison is the fact that they have fatherless families. And no, I'm not trying to beat up on women who are trying to do their best to raise their children. They're acting responsibly. What I'm saying is the fathers who have just disappeared from society, and in some ways have been encouraged to disappear in society because of the way society has ruled on a few things, that the father has no responsibility for the child. It's up to the woman because it's her body, so she's the only one that can decide the fate of the child. You're encouraging fathers to not take ownership, and that's wrong. Fathers should jump in and be fathers. But because they don't, then you have much greater problems. And that's not the only consistency with people. Some people that come from great families end up in prison, but the much, much higher percentage. And the problem is right now, there's a much, much, much higher percentage of black children growing up without fathers. So what should you expect? There to be more problems. So the answer to that, because there's a lot of white children growing up without fathers, is dads, get your act together. Take responsibility, make relationships work, and be a father. But not to condemn all cops as being racist because they're doing their job. That's wrong. What is the Christian culture then? If that's the culture that says that's happening out there now, what's the Christian culture? Well, Mark 12:29 says, Jesus answered him, the first of all the commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. This is the first commandment, and the second is like this. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, if I was to take an extreme reading of this, I'd say, well, it's only for Israel, because he said, Hear, O Israel. But Israel is supposed to be all of God's children. That's who it's always supposed to be. The physical nation was supposed to be the children of God. And now the church is supposed to be the children of God. So hear, O Israel, these are really a summation of the commandments. Love God and love your fellow man. Well, some people would jump up and say, aha, see, you hate homosexuality because you don't agree with homosexuality. And I say, well, that's a nuts assumption. I work with a number of people who are homosexual. They probably think that I'm a very loving, concerned person to work with. Of course, they maybe don't even know that I'm against homosexuality because I don't often talk to people about sex at work. But that has nothing to do with whether or not I agree with homosexuality. You see, I don't agree with it. I don't agree with fornication. I don't agree with adultery. I think that they're all sin. I don't even agree with smoking. It doesn't mean that I hate somebody who smokes. I just think that it's in their best interest not to. That's it. It's not my goal to judge them. Outside of that, I have some responsibility for judging within my own family, my own children, while they're under my care. But when they're not under my care, I don't even have that responsibility. I just have the responsibility to guide and counsel. And that I'll take seriously. But just because I tell the smoker, if they asked if I think smoking is bad, doesn't mean I hate the smoker. Most cases, people would recognize that I love the smoker if I tell them that I don't think that that's best in their best interest. So, no, there's oftentimes these false accusation of hatred and intolerance by people who are actually expressing hatred, intolerance when they're doing it. Christianity does not teach revenge. In Romans 12:14 it says, Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Because sometimes it's not possible to live peaceably with all men, but it's got nothing to do with you. But if it depends on you, do so. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Well, that's really hard. When somebody's done some injustice to you, you'd like to reach out and really hammer back at them. But that's not our responsibility. God's the judge. I used to say this to my kids when they were playing sports. I says, don't be caught wasting your time arguing with the ref about his call. Your job is to play the game. His job is to ref the game. And I can remember distinctly talking to my one son the one game about it, and I says, you missed your next opportunity to score because you were arguing with the ref when you shouldn't have been. And his whole team kind of took it to heart when I said that, when I talked to him, because I told him, regardless of what the ref does, regardless of what the coach does, I'll pull you out if you do that again, because your job is to play the game. Well, you know what? Our job in life is to be Christian. When judgment comes, it's up to God. Vengeance is mine, I will repay. They won't get away with it. God sees it. God will take care of it. Can we leave it in God's hands? I know sometimes that's very hard for somebody like me that would like to deal with it. But we must leave it in God's hands and continue to focus on being the light to the world. So that's where it goes into verse 20. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink, for in doing so you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Hard to do, but that's Christianity. That's not what you see in some of the aspects of the news media and what they're encouraging. And we see that mostly encouraging by what's been transpiring lately with regards to slavery. Well, you get this picture of slavery that all white Christians, because it's from the South, it's the white Christians that were hateful and that were really terrible to the slaves. Well, this is what the Christian background of the nation said. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know, if you're a Christian that reads your Bible, you might notice in your Bible that color is mentioned thousands of times, but never once with regards to race. Why? We all come from the same parents. We might have different hair color, we might have different skin color, we might have different eye color. So what? The only thing that's important is, are we a child of God or a child of Satan? That's the only thing that's important. Now, some facts about slavery. Christianity was the major force in ending slave trade worldwide. It's still a major force trying to end slavery today. The slavery today isn't based on race necessarily. The slavery today is sex slaves. And a major force, Christianity is a major force trying to end that, trying to stop that. Now, when people want to hammer white people for that, over 70% of white Southerners never owned slaves. So how much are you going to take from them? Well, multiple Black Lives Matter supporting websites, because I went around and I looked at a number of them, state that whites should have their homes taken from them. Entitlement, they teach entitlement and revenge. Most of them had nothing to do with it. Again, it's the idea of slandering and teaching entitlement and teaching hatred towards somebody else who never did a thing to you. It's terrible. Israel's heritage. Well, Israel went down to Egypt and was treated well by Joseph in Egypt. They were treated well as strangers. But then when they became numerous, they were turned into slaves. And then they had all their young children killed. When God responded to this, he didn't allow Israel to exact revenge. Isn't that kind of fascinating? He delivered Israel and then told them in Deuteronomy 10:18, he told them in a number of different passages, he administers justice for the fatherless and the widow and loves the stranger, giving him food and clothing. Therefore love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So instead of seeking revenge, what were you supposed to get out of that experience? How would you have liked to have been treated the whole time in Egypt? That's how you should treat others. Well, isn't that remarkable? In Isaiah 19, God says even something more remarkable in verse 24. In that day, Israel will be one of three with Egypt and Assyria. A blessing in the midst of the land. Why Assyria? Because Assyria is just north of Israel. It's not up in Europe. It's just north of Israel. And Egypt's just southwest of Israel. So in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, blessed is Egypt, my people. And Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. I don't think he was trying to teach Israel, anyway, shape or form through there, to always be hateful and vengeful towards Egypt. I think he tried to get them to be a light in the midst of the world. The golden rule, in Matthew 5:44, I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. And pray for those, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? This golden rule does not apply in Islam. Sometimes you see that in the schools. It applies in all the different major world religions, including Islam. Well, it doesn't apply to in Islam towards those who are outside of Islam. But lots of times people don't want to be honest about that. The golden rule applies to Islam. Is supposed to treat other Muslims like that, but they have that battle amongst themselves. But it doesn't. They don't have to treat other people outside the same. That is different amongst Christianity. It also doesn't apply in socialism to those who are outside. They believe in forcing submission too. A totally different way to deal with things. Whereas Christians are told to love their enemies. Period. Virtue, regardless if you can get away with it or not. In Deuteronomy 22:1 it says, you shall not see your brother's ox or a sheep going astray and hide yourself from them. You shall certainly bring them back to your brother. So you got to go out of your way and bring them back to him. And if your brother is not near you, or if you do not know him, then you shall bring it to your own house, and you shall remain with you until your brother seeks it. Then you shall restore it to him. You shall do the same with his donkey, and so you shall do with his garment. With any lost thing of your brother's, which he has lost and you have found, you should do likewise. You must not hide yourself. What does that mean? Regardless of whether anybody else sees, regardless of, you know. So you're going to treat your brother with respect, and if he's lost something, it's not losers weepers, finders keeper. It's not that at all. That's not our Christian heritage. It's theirs. Give it back to them, regardless of anybody else sees, because that's virtue. Now, about Christians enforcing submission. Most religious organizations do have forced submission to their tradition and rules. Most of these, however, still believe they have to love each other. They have to love others. But they're a little extreme in their forced submission, and I'll agree with that. Christ, however, in the Bible is not about enforced submission, except in your group for the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus within the church. And then that's in a very specific sense. If somebody says, well, I don't have to be sexually immoral, well, then there is room for judgment there. If someone says they don't need to keep the Sabbath, then there's room for judgment there. Now, if somebody's trying to keep the Sabbath, and you have some slight differences, because the Pharisees ended up creating like 1,000 rules about differences, that's got nothing to do with it. It says, don't judge based on additional rules of man, above and beyond these. Just does someone seek to follow God? Paul says, why submit to man's rules to think of yourself more righteous? And when he's saying that, he's also telling them not to enforce man's rules in any way, shape, or form. Just the basic Christianity, basic commandments, basic testimony of Jesus. In 1 Peter 2:13, it says this, therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. As free, not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the king. Honor all people. And in this, Christians should have had respect for law and respect for the law enforcement. Because they're there generally to protect us, to keep us from crime, to keep us from evil. Virtue. Philippians 4:8. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. And 2 Peter 1:4, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust, but also for this very reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, the commitment to a moral code. To virtue, knowledge, know what you need to do. To knowledge, self-control. Once you know it, then you got to be able to follow it. To self-control, perseverance. To perseverance, godliness. To godliness, brotherly kindness. And to brotherly kindness, love. For if these things are yours and abound, you will be neither barren nor unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. That's the Christian heritage again. If you want to know more about the virtuous women, you can take your time to look up Proverbs 31. But another example of a virtuous woman is Ruth, a wonderful story, and a virtuous woman. So how are we to win converts if it's not forced submission? Should we all be screaming a warning? Are we all like Ezekiel, a watchman? Should we be forcing submission? Well, Ezekiel was appointed to go forth and say what God had given him to say. Most of us haven't been told something like that. And in some cases, it's just plain wrong for us to do that. So in Thessalonians 3:10, I think this is 2 Thessalonians 3:10. For even when we were with you, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. For we hear that there are some who walk among you in a disorderly manner, not working at all, but are busybodies. Now those who are such we command and exhort through our Lord Jesus Christ that they work in quietness and eat their own bread. So what's this saying? Okay, here's somebody who's not taking care of their own life, but they're a busybody. They're telling everybody else how to live. Well, God says, don't do that. Why don't you take care of your own life quietly? No need to tell everybody else. When somebody's really a busybody and they're not taking care of themselves, they're thought of as a know-it-all. Now, is that somebody who's considered humbly doing God's will, or is that somebody who's considered arrogant? And that's part of the look that people have to consider when you're considering the various applications of how people should be presenting themselves. In Revelation 22:11, we have another passage here where it says, he who is unjust, let him be unjust still. He who is filthy, let him be filthy still. He who is righteous, let him be righteous still. He who is holy, let him be holy still. It's not about your enforced submission. However, there are sometimes people that are under your care, and it describes that in the law. People who are under your care, people that you have responsibility for, like your children while they're in your household, it tells you that you should enforce them to be responsible before God. But you want to do it so that it becomes who they are, they morally understand what their requirements are, and so that they seek to do it. In 1 Peter 3:1, wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands. Likewise means, this is supposed to be done by both parties. Yet, even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives. Now, I get a kick out of this because if one was to describe a really terrible wife, one of the first words that would come out would be nagging. And the passage here, that your husbands could be won without a word. I say that perfectly describes the exact opposite of a nagging wife. Well, how is she winning them if she's not doing it with words? Well, she's doing it with deeds. May be won by the conduct of their wives, when they observe her chaste conduct accompanied by fear. Now, unfortunately, we often think of chaste with regards to sexual immorality, which is not a bad thing to consider. It's good to be chaste from sexual. But chaste conduct can be referring to all moral responsibility, meaning she actually believes what she believes because she actually lives it. She has a life of being pure and seeking to do well. And in that, it's who she is. It's from in here. And that's where you get to the next part. Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. Just be the right person with all kinds of kindness and goodness, and see how that has an effect on people around you. Virtue. Pursue righteousness. Humbly seek to do God's will and love God and others. When we look at the fruit of God's Spirit in Galatians 5:22, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Well, these are some pretty fascinating verses, because in dealing with faithfulness and self-control, it's about being hard on oneself to do what's right. Really taking a hard look on oneself and to seek to do what's right. But when you look at peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, gentleness, that describes the way we consider others. Really wanting to quickly forgive. We'll put up with all kinds of stuff, but we want to be gentle. We want to have kindness. We want to have restoration. We want to have reconciliation. We want to bring them up with as much love and care as possible. And I tend to think having a daughter is a good example of this one. Because when you have a daughter, you want to treat her with gentleness. You want to treat her with kindness. You want to treat her with goodness. Well, you want her to know what's right and wrong. But you're a big man. She's a gentle girl. It forces you to start to learn some of these principles. This is actually in contrast to the way people often deal with people when you consider it from a carnal perspective. We're really hard on everybody else, and we're quick and easy to forgive ourselves. Maybe we ought to be the exact opposite. Let's work hard on being the right people. It'll be really easy and quick to be forgiving and blind to everybody else's faults. Christians must be merciful and a humble people. They must be people that encourage virtue, not entitlement, and they do it by their example, not forced submission.